He was once the man nobody saw, a shadow financier, a hidden force, a name whispered in boardrooms and police stations, yet when he emerged, the revelations were explosive. Vusimuzi Cat Matlala, the Pretoria-based Tenderpreneur, now stands accused of orchestrating a corruption syndicate the likes of which South Africa has rarely seen. From the corridors of SAPS to the offices of the Gauteng Health Department, his companies won contracts worth hundreds of millions, deals now flagged for fraud, collusion and state capture. His name now lies at the heart of the Big Five cartel, a network exposed by KZN's top cop, Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, who shocked the nation by accusing Matlala of deep infiltration of the police and political system. He's been linked to the very scandal that cost whistleblower Babita Deokaran her life, a contract fraud investigation she pursued until her assassination. Today, he's behind bars, charged not just with corruption and tender fraud, but with murder conspiracy, attempting to silence the truth. Investigations by the Special Investigating Unit, the Madlanga Commission, and anti-graft watchdogs are now aligning to unravel his web. This is the story of how a man went from invisible to invincible, how he pulled strings in the highest echelons of power, and why his fall could expose some of the deepest rot in South Africa's public institutions. Before we dive into this gripping narrative, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast. We'd also appreciate it if you followed our sister podcast, Unsolved Murders SA, where we delve into South Africa's most unsettling cold cases. If you enjoy our content and want to support independent journalism, please consider sending us a donation. A gift as small as a cup of coffee is highly appreciated. See the link in the description for details about how to make a donation. Your support helps us keep these stories alive, shedding light on the darkness that still grips our nation. Please take note, the views, opinions, and information expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Swishapost, its parent company I Wish You Would Publications, and its partners. Some of the content featured in this series describes details of extreme violence, therefore, viewers' discretion is strongly advised. For most South Africans, the name Vusimuzi Cat Matlala only began ringing alarm bells in the mid-2020s when his empire of state tenders and underworld connections was exposed by police generals and investigative journalists. But Matlala's rise did not happen overnight. His roots are buried in a long criminal past, one that shaped the tender king he would later become. In the early 2000s, Matlala was already on the radar of law enforcement. He was convicted of theft and fraud, charges that hinted at his appetite for fast money and manipulation of systems. Over the next decade, his reputation grew in the criminal underworld. He earned his nickname Cat in two ways. First, from the Mamelodi slang, Gata for cash in transit heist, and second, because of his near miraculous survival of a 2016 shootout in Sandton. That year, Matlala was arrested after police found him with a cache of R5 rifles, police radios, SAPS bulletproof vests, and cell phone jamming devices, all the tools of an organized cash-in-transit gang. In the bloody gun battle that erupted during the bust, one of Matlala's accomplices died, but he escaped with only a wound. To those around him, he became the cat with 9 lives. Even before his tenderpreneurship years, Matlala was never far from notorious company. His name surfaced alongside underworld figures linked to Czech mobster Rado van Kreschke, a sign of how he comfortably navigated Johannesburg's violent criminal networks. Yet what set him apart was not just his proximity to the underworld, but his ability to pivot from crime to contracts, to trade in guns one day and boardroom deals the next. The turning point came in 2024 when his company, Medicare 24 Tshwane District, won a 360 million rand health services contract with SAPS. On paper, the deal was about providing healthcare to police officers and staff. In reality, it was a feeding trough. Millions flowed into Medicare 24's accounts in a matter of months until Police Commissioner Fani Masemola abruptly cancelled the contract, citing procurement irregularities and corruption red flags. By then, the damage was done. Matlala had established himself as a player in the world of state tenders, a man who could turn a government contract into a personal fortune almost overnight. It was not only SAPS that bore the cost of his rise. The Gauteng Health Department, already scandal-ridden, became another arena where Matlala's companies appeared in forensic audits. Some of the very payments flagged by whistleblower Babita Diakaran, assassinated in 2021 for exposing the Tembisa Hospital tender rot, were linked to networks in which Matlala's fingerprints would later be found. The irony was sharp. The death of a woman who risked everything to shine a light on systemic graft now tied back to the man whose empire epitomized it. As the years rolled on, Matlala's profile became more brazen. He lived lavishly, surrounding himself with symbols of power and wealth, while at the same time keeping one foot in the violent world of assassination plots and underworld rivalries. In the public eye, he was both a businessman and a gangster, a man who blurred the lines between corporate contracts and criminal conspiracies. By the time Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi publicly named him as part of the Big Five cartel that had infiltrated the highest levels of policing and government, Matlala was no longer just another shady tenderpreneur. He was the embodiment of a system where crime, politics, and procurement collided. From petty theft charges to multi-million rand contracts, from gangland arrests to high-level investigations, the trajectory of Vusimuzi Cat Matlala's life reveals the anatomy of influence. His origins were not in boardrooms or parliament corridors, but in the shadows of crime. Shadows he never truly left, even as billions of rands from the public purse flowed into his orbit. The moment Vusimuzi Cat Matlala shifted from being an underworld whisper to a national headline came with the SAPS Health Services tender of 2024. His company, Medicare 24 Tshwane District, was handed a contract with 360 million rand to provide healthcare services for 180,000 police officers. On the surface, it looked like a breakthrough deal for an obscure firm, but beneath, the award was riddled with irregularities. Bid documents tampered with, directors rotated in and out, evaluation scorecards mysteriously missing. Despite a preliminary audit recommending cancellation, SAPS continued paying Matlala's firm. Within months, 50 million rand had already landed in his accounts. Even after internal warnings of fronting, collusion and fraud, top brass still authorized additional payments. It took Police Commissioner Fani Masemola 103 days to act, by which point the scandal had metastasized into something larger than procurement failure. The fallout was seismic. When KwaZulu-Natal Police Commissioner Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi called a press conference in 2025, flanked by the Special Task Force in full camouflage, he accused his own leadership of being captured by underworld interests. At the center of his broadside was Matlala. He alleged that Matlala had paid bribes to the then police minister Senzo Mchunu to protect his SAPS contract and smother criminal probes. WhatsApp exchanges showed Matlala's allies plotting with Deputy Commissioner Shadrach Sibiya and political intermediaries, with proof of payment messages confirming transfers of over 100,000 rand from Medicare 24's account. In return, task teams probing political killings, teams that also had Matlala in their sights, were disbanded. This was the point at which Cat ceased to be a name muttered in criminal dockets and became a symbol of state capture inside SAPS. The irony was brutal. A company established months before the tender now had the power to bend police structures, redirect investigations, and enlist ministers in its survival. But the SAPS saga was only half of the story. While police contracts revealed Matlala's influence in the security sector, his fingerprints were already embedded in the healthcare corruption scandal that claimed the life of whistleblower Babita Diakaran. In 2021, Diakaran, a senior Gauteng health official, raised alarms about suspicious payments flowing out of Tembisa Hospital. She flagged dozens of small companies suddenly winning multi-million rand contracts, companies with no track record linked by proxy directors and laundering chains. 19 days later, she was assassinated outside her home. 3 years on, the Special Investigating Unit confirmed that Diakaran's suspicions were correct. Their interim report revealed that 9 syndicates had extracted 2 billion rand from Tembisa in just 2 years, with 122 million in kickbacks paid to health department officials. Among the tender dons exposed was Hangwani, Morgan, Maumela, but within the web were also 3 companies linked to Vusimuzi Matlala, which pocketed just under 15 million rand. The overlap was chilling. Here was the same man who had won a 9-figure SAPS contract, also profiting from a syndicate whose exposure led directly to the whistleblower's death. Investigators later confirmed that Matlala's payments from Tembisa were part of the exact flows Diakaran had tried to stop. In effect, the very corruption she died opposing was the foundation stone of the fortune that made him powerful enough to capture SAPS tenders. By the time his SAPS deal was cancelled in May 2025, Matlala had already been arrested on attempted murder and conspiracy charges linked to a failed hit on his former partner, actress Tebogo Tobejane. But the true scandal was broader. The collapse of his police contract, the public expose by Mkhwanazi, and the confirmation of his role in the Tembisa plunder revealed how his influence had grown unchecked. These were the turning points where tenders became empires, empires demanded political protection, and political protection collided with the blood price paid by whistleblowers. Matlala's story is not just about corruption in numbers, it's about the anatomy of capture, the way one man could straddle both the police service and a collapsing health department, and how the silencing of voices like Babita Diakarans became the cost of his survival. By 2023, Vusimuzi Cat Matlala was no longer just a tenderpreneur hiding behind shell companies and shady contracts. He'd crossed fully into the world of organized violence. The botched assassination attempt on actress and socialite Tobejane, his former partner, marked a turning point. Gunmen sprayed her car with automatic fire outside a Bryanston nightclub. She survived, but another woman traveling with her was hit and paralyzed. For investigators, it was the moment when Matlala's corruption empire spilled blood on Johannesburg streets. The state alleged that Matlala had paid 120,000 rand to triggermen to silence Tobejane. But this was not an isolated act. Ballistic forensics linked weapons seized from the hitmen to at least 10 high-profile murders, including botched attacks on taxi boss Joe Ferrari Sibanyoni and Pretoria's DJ Vettis. Sibanyoni's car was riddled with bullets in 2022, while DJ Vettis and 3 others were wounded in a separate ambush in 2023. Both survived, but the trail led back to the same networks orbiting Matlala. At the center of this growing scandal was not just a businessman who hired assassins, but a man with the protection of the police service itself. Lieutenant General Mkhwanazi stood before cameras in 2025 and detonated a political bombshell. Matlala, he said, had been bankrolling protection from the very top of SAPS. He singled out the then police minister Senzo Mchunu, who was accused of receiving secret payments via an intermediary, Brown Mokhotsi, in exchange for collapsing the police's political killings task team. That unit, crucially, had been closing in on the Tobejane attempted murder docket. The fallout was immediate. Mchunu was placed on special leave. President Ramaphosa authorized a full judicial commission of inquiry into the allegations. At the same time, the Investigating Directorate Against Corruption, or IDAC, announced a probe into how Matlala's 360 million rand SAPS contract had ever been awarded in the first place. Internal audits found bid rigging, scorecard tampering, and fronting. At least 18 million rand had already been siphoned off as irregular expenditure before Commissioner Masimola cancelled the deal. Within days, Matlala was in handcuffs after a dramatic highway sting in Midrand. While he fought to deny bail in the Alexandra Magistrates Court, appearing shackled but dressed in 27,000 rand Dolce & Gabbana hoodies and Givenchy sneakers, the institutions of accountability circled in. The SIU, which had already tied Matlala's companies to contracts flagged by Babita Diakarans before her murder, broadened its mandate. It confirmed that syndicates linked to him siphoned millions from Tembisa Hospital, part of the 2.3 billion rand plunder that Diakarans died trying to stop. In parallel, the Matlanga Commission of Inquiry began hearing testimony about the extent of police capture, drawing a direct line from Matlala's payments to political cover and dismantled investigations. Even as these investigations gathered force, the contrast between his public persona and criminal reality could not have been starker. News 24's 9 Lives investigation revealed that while staff at his company, MediaCare 24 Tshwane District, went unpaid, Matlala's family drove a 9 million rand Rolls-Royce Wraith, rented 95,000 a month mansions in Waterkloof, and jetted off to Turkey for cosmetic surgery. The excess was funded by public contracts that should have brought medical care for police officers and equipment for Gauteng's hospitals. Instead, they bankrolled a private kingdom. Matlala now sits in prison facing an array of charges: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, money laundering, and fraud. But the deeper story is not just about one man's downfall. It's about a system that allowed a figure with more than 13 prior police investigations on his record to secure contracts worth hundreds of millions. It's about assassinations and middlemen bought with tender money, and it's about whistleblowers murdered or silenced while institutions dragged their feet until the scandal became too large to ignore. The first institution to strip away the mystique around Vusimuzi Cat Matlala did not arrive with blue lights or primetime presses. It came with spreadsheets, bank statements, and procurement bundles. The SIU's language, syndicates, conduits, kickbacks, tainted at every link, read like an anatomy lesson in state capture written at hospital scale. The picture drawn explained not only how money moved, but why the network endured. Every step in the chain was paid, and thus every step had its own reason to keep moving. When the SIU's interim findings named Maumela's network, froze assets worth hundreds of millions, and still reserved a third, Syndicate X, for later unmasking to avoid asset flight, the implication was clear. The ecosystem that enriched these contractors had been built with the help of the state's own hands, and in that ecosystem, Matlala's companies featured as quiet cogs, small enough to miss if you watched the headlines, unavoidable if you followed the ledgers. While the SIU audited a hospital's veins, a different institution prepared to autopsy the body politic. The Madlanga Commission was constructed after KZN's police commissioner detonated his warning that organized criminals had penetrated the justice system. The president's order that a judge take evidence under oath, in open session where possible and in camera where necessary, carried a simple message. The allegations had outgrown the nightly news cycle. They would now be tested with exhibits, transcripts, and consequences. On day 8 of the hearings, South Africa watched crime intelligence head Dumisani Khumalo take an oath and assert that Matlala, along with Santon businessman Gatiso Molefe, formed part of the influential Big Five that had bent the police service to its will. He spoke of sponsorships for ruling party gala events, of payments routed through intermediaries, of business deals with the son of a Hawks general, and of WhatsApp strands that, in his telling, captured the mundanity of capture. Who requests flights, who delivers guest lists, who signs off fuel, who carries envelopes, who disbands a task team that has become dangerous to the wrong beneficiaries. The commission's gallery was silent as he set out the claim that the Big Five had a head office in Gauteng and a portfolio across drugs, hijacking, kidnappings, contract killings, tender fraud, and extortion. A diversified business model if you stripped it of its blood and the public money. Khumalo's testimony drew a line between skirting the rules and taking the whole rulebook. He said messages and proof of payment slips pointed to how a political go-between, Brown Mokhotsi, was positioned as a fixer inside the ministry, a man who could deliver the dissolution of a task team and, when needed, the flow of police payments to a company that should have never had a contract. He described how National Commissioner Masemola had admitted that corruption investigators warned him about Medicare 2420 District's dodgy status before it ever received its first SAPS check, and how even after an internal audit recommended cancellation, the contract was allowed to run for 103 days, long enough for 50 million rand to be paid out. He alleged that the same fixer pushed to disband the political killings task team under the impression that it was hunting Matlala, even as the team members were in fact being seconded to a Gauteng counterintelligence investigation into him. The logic was circular and efficient. Collapse the unit you fear, even if you misunderstand its remit. Keep the checks coming for as long as plausible, and send the signal that surveillance runs in both directions. The Commission's purpose is not to act as a court. It's to make a public record and force the political system to choose. Yet the detail in the exhibits gave the public a way to measure claims. When News 24 published the proof that 111,000 rand had been paid from Medicare 24's account to a company run by a director linked to Mokhotsi 10 days after he messaged that a task team had been dissolved, the words allegation and denial no longer sat alone in a vacuum. They now sat next to a bank transfer. When the same investigation documented that former police minister Bekicele had enjoyed access to Matlala's luxury penthouse while the tender acrobatics unfolded, an arrangement Cele acknowledged even as he denied any business relationship, the line between proximity and propriety became a matter for citizens to weigh as much as for prosecutors. The point was not to prove guilt by association, it was to prove access by evidence. If the commission is the theatre of testimony, the SIU is the ledger's conscience. In the Tembisa matter, its investigators documented how the hospital's procurement pipeline had been repurposed to sustain private empires. They named officials, tallied kickbacks, and described how even buckets could be billed at luxury good prices when the system forgot how to be ashamed. They identified secondary conduit accounts that existed to launder money from service providers to ultimate beneficiaries, and they described a pattern of enrichment that would be familiar to anyone who's read a forensic report in post-date capture South Africa. Property portfolios expanding as ward budgets shrink, vehicles acquired as clinics defer repairs, trips taken as wards go understaffed. Amid these sums, the detail that 3 of Matlala's companies were paid just shy of 15 million rand matters less for its absolute value than for its connective tissue. It shows how a figure publicly identified with SAPS procurement and political influence also moved quietly and profitably inside the health department's grey economy. The SIU's interim report did not just place him on the map, it showed the roads that led there. The Matlala Commission, for its part, added the missing ingredient that often keeps financial scandals from feeling like crimes: people. It heard how crime intelligence colonel Smanga Simelane and 5 others flew on tickets that investigators say were paid by Matlala's company to attend the ANC's January 8 celebrations in Cape Town. It put into the public record the message-by-message choreography of influence, where a fixer promises proximity to power, identifies who should be flown, and explains how a junket today becomes a contract tomorrow. It recorded how Simelane would later assist Matlala to open a theft case over luxury items allegedly missing after a police raid, and how within days the colonel was on a flight whose payment he professed not to recall. If the SIU's tone is clinical, the Commission's tone is human. Together they lay out systems and incentives, perks and pressure points, until the ideal for a capture institution is no longer abstract. It looks like a calendar and a boarding pass. The shape of the endgame is usually visible in the shape of the last moves. In the weeks leading up to and including crime intelligence's testimony at the Matlala Commission, the public received 3 kinds of signals. The first was institutional. The president endorsed the inquiry scope as a matter of grave national security and urged restraint among those trading accusations from the police podiums, signaling that whatever political discomfort lay ahead, the record-making would proceed. The second was evidentiary. Journalists published bank confirmations, itinerary lists, access arrangements, and audit excerpts that anchored allegations in documents and not rumors. The third was procedural. Cancellation letters, disciplinary referrals, asset restraint orders, and docket transfers that shows how a scandal becomes a case. Within the Matlala Commission, the immediate development is the evidence leader's plan to trawl through the WhatsApp strands that Kumalo referenced. He previewed 5 clusters of messages, each designed to show a different facet of the web: contact with the KZN Hawk's head and his son, arrangements with an active Metropolitan Police chief, coordination with an academic and a businessman, and the exchanges with Mokgotsi that linked payments to political events and ultimately to decisions inside SAPS itself. The promise to ventilate these strands is not theatre, it is method. A single payment can be waved away as generosity. A sequence becomes a pattern. When the pattern aligns with official acts, the dissolution of a task team, the transfer of dockets, the sustained life of a tender post-audit, it becomes a map, and that map is what commissions exist to draw. Parallel to the commission, the SIU's interim report describes a calendar of its own. It's already prepared over 100 disciplinary referrals in the Gauteng health matter and indicated that criminal referrals to the MPA will follow. It expects to finalize the Tembisa report in 2027, an acknowledgement of how many procurement bundles and money trails still need to be tested forensically. This protracted horizon may frustrate a public conditioned by headline cadence, but it also reflects a real choice: build a case that can survive legal attack, or build a press release that cannot. The watchdog brief, then, is not to ask for speed at all costs. It's to ask for speed where possible and endurance where necessary. In the meantime, the interim findings stand. They establish the scale of theft, they name the mechanics of theft, and they place Matlala inside that frame. The parliamentary and executive responses grow from the same root. Once the Commission's record becomes public in fuller form, Parliament's relevant committees will move from briefed to seized, and the presidency will have to choose between rhetoric and remedy. In practical terms, what to watch begins with personnel and powers. Personnel because the figures named in testimony, from ministers to commissioners to colonels, do not occupy ceremonial offices. They sign budgets, appoint command structures, and greenlight tasking orders. Powers because the Commission's most detailed findings, like the SIU's, are only as sharp as the institutions permitted to act on them. If IDAC is already investigating the SAPS tender award, the test is whether it will indict not only the shell, but the hands that fed it. If the SIU has mapped the health department's conduits, the test is how quickly assets can be frozen and how thoroughly illicit gains can be recovered. The public has seen what cancellations look like. Now it will learn what consequence looks like. Some of the most revealing developments since mid-year have not involved a single courtroom. They've involved the quiet documentation of proximity. When it became public that former Minister Betrayal had access to Matlala's luxury penthouse at Manland, Maine, an arrangement he acknowledged while denying any business ties, it placed a pin on the map of relationships that commissions and prosecutors are paid to read. The penthouse stays, on their own, do not prove bribery, they prove channel. The same is true of the ANC gala flights that Matlala's company paid for at Mokgotzi's urging. a package that included a crime intelligence colonel amongst the 6 passengers. A trip cannot convict. A calendar can connect though. Watch for the commission to organize that calendar under oath. The second category of development sits not in Pretoria, but in Ekurhuleni and Johannesburg, in magistrates' courts and regional dockets where the criminal cases against Matlala move at their own speed. He's been denied bail, faces conspiracy and attempted murder counts, and sits inside a matrix of investigations that touch not only his personal life, but his business empire. The coming months will test whether the attempted murder and conspiracy allegations, including the botched hit on Tebogo Tabejane, can be proved with the forensic tightness that assassinations demand. It will test whether the alleged ballistics links to other attacks hold up under expert cross-examination. It will test whether the money laundering charges can be anchored in specific transactions rather than inferential narratives. Procedurally, watch the admissibility flights first. Phones seized, chains of custody defended, warrants tested, and the inevitability challenges to search and seizure operations. Substantively, watch the bridge the state must build between chats and acts. If the purpose of a conclusion is to say what the story means, then the purpose of these closing movements is to say what the story requires. The institutions have placed their markers. The SIU has called the flows what they are and mapped them with enough precision to sustain a years-long prosecution strategy. The Madlanga Commission has sworn testimony onto a public stage where it can be tested, contradicted, or confirmed. The presidency has conceded that the allegations cut to the bone of national security. Parliament has signaled that oversight will not be left to press conferences, and the criminal justice system, halting but unmistakably, has placed a man who once appeared untouchable in a prison cell to wait for trial. What to watch going forward is not a mystery. Watch the documents move from exhibits to indictments. Watch the people behind the job titles either explain their proximity or surrender their posts. Watch the money, because it is better at telling the truth than anyone paid to keep it quiet. And watch the institutions, because their willingness to finish what they have started will tell the country whether this was a scandal contained or a system confronted. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast and follow our sister show, Unsolved Murders SA, where we explore South Africa's most haunting cold cases. If our work resonates with you, consider supporting independent journalism by making a small donation. Even the value of a cup of coffee helps us continue bringing these stories to light. You'll find a link in the description with all the details. Your support ensures that the stories of victims, their families, and the communities they leave behind are never forgotten, and that we can keep shining a light into the darkest corners of our society. Please remember, the views and opinions shared in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Sister Post, its parent company, Our Wisherwood Publications, or its partners. Some of the content featured in the series describes details of extreme violence. We urge our listeners to practice discretion and to prioritize their well-being while engaging with our content. Until the next episode, stay safe, stay aware, and thank you for helping us keep these stories alive.